the Boora Complex in the central Midlands, and it deals with the reality of this post-productive landscape of peat that's been extracted, which obviously is a carbon-intensive process for developing or making of electricity or energy. As you probably all know, we import 86% of all our energy requirements, and half of the energy that we produce ourselves comes from peat. But the area land by 2030 that remains in this essentially post-productive state in the central Midlands is equal to 800 square kilometres, or in actual fact is the area of County Dublin. To date, there's been much research and anticipation about what this landscape will become, but it's probably one of the most interesting projects that could ever happen in this state, is that it's all owned by one state organisation. It's anticipated that it will be or have a vast matrix of uses. Our proposition was that it would be a landscape which would be dedicated to the production of energy and food. We import almost €750 million worth of protected horticulture every year, largely because of the costs of energy here. And in this future landscape, one could anticipate that across a matrix of uses, from wind farms to wetlands, conserved areas, infrastructure, grasslands, production of biomass and biofuel, that we would generate a new economy in the Midlands. So the reality was moving from this depleted post-productive state to regenerating a landscape which in a way is one vast national park or wilderness. It's also a landscape for energy production. And it's thought of almost an industrial scale in a way. So I guess what we wanted to do is look at some case study within that context. The reality that we find ourselves in today is that in 2006, we are still 96% of all energy consumption in Ireland is based on fossil fuels. It's nearly all imported. But there's a new paradigm, of course, because of Kyoto. Because of our EU agreements, we're committed to producing 33% of our electricity consumption from renewables by 2020. 30% of co-firing with biomass to be achieved in state-owned peat power stations by 2015. Most of these are located in the central Midlands, Shannon Bridge and Eden Derry, and also in Longford. So there's a new reality out there in a way, and whereas the economy of places like Central Midlands, which is largely based on construction for the last 10 years, in a way that has to kind of readdress the reality of this changing state that we find ourselves in. So in relation to Offaly, which is of course central to this whole discussion, it's really a county of 2, if not 3 stories, quite separate. According to the National Spatial Strategy, Tullamore is supposed to grow from a population of 13,000 people to 30,000 people by 2020. It's situated in the middle of the county. And along with Athlone and Mullingar to form a kind of critical mass in the centre of the country to drive local economy. Tullamore has increased in its population, but not anywhere near as much as it should be. However, to the east, in Portarlington and Eden Derry, they've grown exponentially by some 50%, and that's of course because it's driven by it's within the commuter belt of the Greater Dublin area. To the west, the county, in actual fact, the population is depleting. And I think it comes back to this very core issue about planning and having a strategy and implementing strategy, and the success or largely failure, in actual fact, of the planning system in delivering the National Spatial Strategy. An area of map, if you see Tullamore up in the top right-hand corner, and you can see that to the left, located around the Shannon, this post-productive landscape, and situated in that are the service towns of Kilcormac, Ferban and Banagher, which you see here on the left-hand side, with Clohan, the village, in the centre. These 3 service towns in the west of Offaly have 20% of all the zoned land in the county. They have a combined population, along with Dangan in the east, of 4,703 people. That's 6.6% of the population. They have enough zoned land to quadruple their respective populations. However, in contrast to that, Tullamore actually doesn't have enough zoned land to increase its population to the requirements of the National Spatial Strategy. It's worth noting also that the total combined increase in population of those 3 towns in the west of Offaly over the duration of the period 1996 to 2006, which is probably the, I guess, period of greatest economic growth in the state and of population growth in the order of 20-25%, was a total of 17 people. If you work out the maths, that's about, they were wrong by about, let's say the planning department was wrong by about 800%. So if you look at Ferban and Kilcormac, the reality of that, well, the reality is because they have too much zoned land, we get non-contiguous urban development. And even though these are small satellite towns with a small service area, most of the people living there are car dependent. And that's what, I guess, is generated in terms of urban form is extremely poor, and their quality of life is poor. And the quality of life that's possibly offered by these small towns is seriously depleted. In the background, you can see this post-productive landscape. What we're trying to say is that there's a connection between the economy of these towns and their hinterland, and that needs to be re-established, and that codependency needs to be integrated into planning policy. So this is Banagher. Banagher actually's population did increase by 222 people in this 10-year year period, or let's say 22 people a year. But in the middle of the 19th century, the population of Banagher was 3,000 people. It was twice the population it is today. But if you look at the footprint, you can see the red line is the footprint in the middle of the 19th century, and the blue line is the footprint today. So we are saying essentially that we need 16 times as much land today per person as we did in the middle of the 19th century. That's our rate of consumption of land. Again, it displays the same kind of poor urban form and distribution. The fact that, again, it's still car-based with a lot of urban development and non-contiguous urban development. So that's the current development plan, which you can see these vast areas of land zoned for residential use. The very simplistic two-dimensional zoning. It has a business district for a town of 1,600 people, seems largely redundant. These are the zonings in the current development plan. You can see that a lot of the zoned areas, including the business district and industrial area, are actually beneath the floodplain. So the proposition, I guess the vision that we have for this place is that it would look something like this. That it would have a population 4 times it has today, even though there's no economy there to support this. Meanwhile, in places like Tullamore, the growth is not delivering the growth that it's supposed to within the National Development Plan. And you can also again see in Banagher this landscape beyond it of this post-industrial, post-productive landscape of peat extraction and the power stations to the rear. So we were proposing that for a start, all the zoned land would be removed since there's no demand for it, but also any future urban growth could take place within the existing footprint of the town, that we could begin to think about planning spatially and 3-dimensionally, not just 2-dimensionally. We would remove all zoning. It seems entirely unnecessary. By doing so, also, you place a value on existing urban land, and our rate of consumption of land has to be, I guess, rethought. That there's no reason to believe that within this footprint that we can't deliver higher density, that we can't provide for the type of housing that people need and the services people need. So the proposition was for a linear park around the town connecting the existing playing fields, and that land that was zoned for residential would be converted to managed woodland. Is part of a broader view of this extended landscape and this connection again back to the landscape and this codependency between a hinterland and settlement. It's a prime candidate for having a combined heat and power plant. It's quite possible that every town in Ireland would be responsible for delivering its own energy requirements. In the case of Banagher, it has a very large concrete factory, cement factory, which of course consumes an enormous amount of energy. Therefore, it makes it an ideal candidate for this type of energy generation, and would connect it back into that landscape. And we would see it as part of planning requirements for every town, that within their own zoning, so to speak, that they manage their own energy affairs. So in a way, those the slides, the top and the bottom, kind of represent two opposing economies in a way, one of construction or just building, and one about landscape and hinterland and energy, And in a way, one is the kind of the past, and one is the future that we're facing, about delivering our energy requirements ourselves and not importing them, and reducing our carbon emissions, and thinking at a scale and how that can be delivered at scale. So this proposition, I guess, is basically looking at reconstructing that landscape and thinking about its value. It's not something we haven't done before. We don't live in a wilderness. We live in a man-made constructed landscape, and thinking about settlement in relation to that. So I end there. Thank you.